In the heart of Rome, a man named Hiroshi Tanaka sharpened his anger so deeply that he carried a dagger meant for the Pope himself. Consumed by rage against the Catholic Church, he fell to his knees before a vision of Mary, transformed by a light he could not deny. This is the true story of Hiroshi Tanaka, set in 1947, amid a world scarred by war, where Italy grappled with the ruins of fascism, the rise of communism, and the Church's towering presence. Hiroshi was a working-class Roman, known to his neighbors as a quiet, intense man devoted to his wife, Aiko, and their children. But beneath this exterior burned a hatred for the Church, fueled by years of poverty and betrayal. Whispers from friends who despised priests as deceivers and the Pope as a symbol of oppression shaped his convictions. The crosses on his walls enraged him. When Aiko taught their children prayers, his fury boiled over. One by one, he tore down every religious symbol in their home, tossing them into the trash, rejecting a faith he saw as hollow. His obsession grew darker, fixating on Pope Pius XII, whom he viewed as the embodiment of corruption. Hiroshi dreamed of a Rome free from the Vatican's influence, a world unshackled from superstition. His plan was stark and chilling: to assassinate the Pope. He carried a dagger etched with the words, "The Pope must die," a weapon that embodied his mission. Yet destiny intervened in ways Hiroshi could never have foreseen. On a quiet day, at a grotto near the Abbey of the Three Fountains, Hiroshi's life collided with an extraordinary vision. Mary appeared, her presence radiating a mercy that shattered his hatred. His dagger, his plans, his rage, all crumbled in the face of this encounter. Hiroshi, once a man consumed by anger, became a powerful witness to Mary's grace. His life forever changed. Born in 1913 into a fractured Rome, Hiroshi grew up in a tenement, surrounded by crowded markets and struggling families. His father, Kenji, was a man broken by disappointment, often drunk and quick to anger. Hiroshi's mother, Yumi, bore the weight of his father's temper, comforting her children through quiet tears. Home felt like a prison, and school offered no escape. Poverty marked Hiroshi with patched clothes and an empty stomach, making him a target for cruel taunts. Each humiliation fueled a growing sense of injustice. By adolescence, Hiroshi learned the world was unkind, hardening his heart. He distrusted authority and scoffed at priests preaching God's love. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Seeking belonging, he was drawn to Rome's political fervor in the 1930s. Communists and anarchists promised a better future, giving Hiroshi a sense of purpose the Church never had. A co-worker, Daichi, introduced him to anti-Catholic ideas, painting the Church as an oppressor and the Pope as a tyrant. Hiroshi, resentful of his past, embraced these ideas. His childhood poverty, his father's cruelty, and his mother's pain all seemed to stem from a corrupt system upheld by the Church. At home, Aiko tried to nurture faith, hanging small crosses and teaching their children prayers. Hiroshi tore them down, his anger flaring at these symbols of an institution he despised. His children, caught between their mother's gentleness and their father's rage, learned to stay quiet. Beneath his fury lay a wound from childhood, a sense of abandonment by his father, society, and God. Every act of rebellion was a cry against that silence. Yet, in the shadows of Rome, at the grotto, Mary's light broke through. Hiroshi's hatred, his dagger, and his plans dissolved in the face of divine mercy. From a man plotting murder, he became a testament to transformation, his story a beacon of hope in a world rebuilding from ruin. His father had given him fear. Society had given him ridicule. An ideology had given him a weapon, a narrative that the Church was to blame. Hiroshi was no longer just a man struggling with pain. He was becoming a man with a mission. A mission to tear down what he thought had torn him apart. What he did not know, what he could not yet imagine, was that the very mother he rejected, the figure he mocked, would one day meet him in the shadows of a Roman grotto, not to condemn him, but to call him home. It is often said that the company we keep shapes the direction of our lives. For Hiroshi, this truth proved devastating. The wounds of his childhood had made him restless, searching for answers. And in that search, he found companions who only deepened his darkness. He met them first at work, men hardened by labor, their hands scarred by machines, their voices roughened by years of shouting over factory noise. Among them were ideologues, men who spoke with fire about freedom from oppression, about overthrowing institutions that had outlived their worth. And in their late-night conversations over cheap wine and cigarettes, the target of their anger was often the same: the Catholic Church. One friend in particular captured Hiroshi's imagination. His name was never written in history books, but to Hiroshi, he was unforgettable. This man, named Haruto Nakamura, carried himself with confidence, quoting scripture not to inspire faith, but to dismantle it. He painted the Bible as a weapon in the hands of deceivers, the Pope as a false prophet, the Church as a parasite feeding on the poor. Every word fell like acid on the fragile faith that still lingered somewhere deep in Hiroshi's soul. For a man already scarred by poverty and humiliation, these arguments made sense. Hiroshi remembered his mother crying while priests passed their collection plates. He remembered the emptiness of promises about God's love contrasted with the reality of hunger. Haruto's words gave shape to his unspoken rage. You are right to hate. You are right to resist. The church is your enemy. What began as doubt hardened into conviction. Hiroshi no longer simply ignored the church. He began to oppose it actively. He scoffed at processions in the streets, mocked priests in their cassocks, and laughed bitterly at the sight of people kneeling in prayer. To him, they were blind sheep, following a shepherd who led them only into chains. At home, this conviction became cruelty. His wife, Aiko, faithful but quiet, tried to hold on to small devotions. She would light a candle in the evening, whispering the rosary with the children. But Hiroshi's anger exploded whenever he discovered it. He tore down the crucifix she placed in the bedroom. He snatched the rosary beads from her hands and threw them into the trash. His voice, loud and sharp, declared that his children would never grow up in ignorance, never bow before priests, never waste their lives in superstition. Neighbors whispered, some pitied his wife, others feared his temper. Few dared to challenge him. Hiroshi walked the streets with the air of a man on a mission, his bitterness cloaked in confidence. Inside, though, his heart grew colder by the day. The anti-Catholic propaganda he absorbed only fueled his fire. Pamphlets circulated, denouncing the Pope as corrupt, calling Marian devotion idolatry, portraying the church as an obstacle to progress. Hiroshi collected these like trophies. He began speaking like Haruto, reciting arguments with the precision of a preacher. Only his gospel was hatred. And yet, beneath the bravado, there were moments of silence that betrayed his unrest. Late at night, after his children were asleep, he would sit alone, staring at the empty wall where a crucifix once hung. He told himself he was free. But the emptiness of that wall reflected the emptiness in his soul. Still, pride kept him from turning back. Instead, he pressed further into ideology, deeper into resentment. The Pope, he decided, was not just a figurehead. He was the heart of the enemy. Remove the Pope and the church would crumble. Remove the church and society would finally be free. Hiroshi had found a cause, but it was poisoned. And it was taking him step by step toward an unthinkable plan. What he could not know, what no one around him could foresee, was that his story was about to take a turn so sharp, so miraculous that even the man who mocked Mary would one day weep at her feet. A man's ideology is never confined to the streets or the factory floor. It seeps into his home, shaping the air his family breathes. For Hiroshi, the war he waged against the church soon became a war against the very walls of his household. Aiko had grown up with simple faith. She treasured the rosary beads given to her by her mother, and she hung small images of Christ and Mary in the rooms where their children slept. To her, these symbols were anchors in a turbulent world, reminders that God had not abandoned them. But to Hiroshi, they were intolerable. One evening, as the children knelt to pray, Hiroshi stormed in, his eyes burning with fury. He ripped the crucifix from the wall, the wood splintering in his hands. "No more lies in this house," he shouted. The children froze, their lips trembling, while their mother gathered them into her arms. The crucifix landed in the trash with a dull thud. The message was clear: faith had no place here. From that day forward, his crusade intensified. Whenever he found a holy card tucked into a book, he tore it to pieces. If he saw a candle burning, he blew it out with a scowl. When Aiko whispered prayers at night, he accused her of poisoning their children with superstition. He would not allow ignorance to thrive under his roof. He said he would raise his children to see the truth, that the church was a parasite and that they would never be its slaves. The children, caught in the middle, learned to adapt. They stopped praying aloud. They tucked their hands under blankets to hide folded fingers. Aiko taught them in secret, her voice barely above a whisper, hoping seeds of faith could survive even in the hostile soil of their father's rage. Neighbors noticed the tension. Some spoke of the Tanaka household in hushed tones, a family divided, a wife too afraid to defy, children walking on eggshells. Yet Hiroshi carried himself with pride, convinced that he was saving his family from deception. He believed he was protecting them from the church's chains, even as he bound them with fear. He even went further. He declared his children would never learn catechism, never step foot in a Catholic classroom. When the parish priest visited, Hiroshi met him at the door with a glare sharp enough to silence any words. The priest left quietly, but not without sorrow in his heart for the children. Still, beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Aiko, though outwardly submissive, carried a quiet strength. She prayed silently, pleading with Mary to watch over her children. She endured Hiroshi's anger, believing that love and patience might one day soften him. The children, though frightened, absorbed her quiet resilience. Seeds of hope remained, hidden but alive. For Hiroshi, there was no turning back. Each act of destruction fed his conviction. Each symbol thrown into the trash was, in his mind, another victory against oppression. He had turned his home into a fortress of defiance, blind to the irony that the peace he claimed to seek was nowhere to be found within his own walls. Yet it was in this fortress of rebellion that the first stirrings of grace would soon break through. The very children he tried to raise without faith would become the instruments of his transformation. Their innocence, their unshakable gaze into a light he could not yet see, would pierce the armor of his hatred. For now, however, Hiroshi stood tall in his certainty. He believed himself a liberator, but his family lived in the shadow of his war. And heaven, watching, prepared a plan that would shatter his walls of pride in a single, unforgettable moment. For years, Hiroshi's hatred had been growing like a storm. It was no longer enough to tear down crucifixes or silence prayers in his home. His anger needed a target greater than holy images. It needed flesh and blood. It needed the Pope. In Hiroshi's eyes, Pope Pius XII was the embodiment of everything wrong with the world: hypocrisy, corruption, power disguised as holiness. He convinced himself that killing the Pope would be an act of justice, a strike against tyranny. What he failed to see was that his obsession was slowly devouring him, twisting every thought until it revolved around destruction. He began to plan quietly, methodically, with the focus of a man possessed. He studied the Pope's appearances, his public audiences, the routes he traveled. He thought of St. Peter's Square, of processions and papal masses, and imagined the chaos his act would unleash. The weapon was simple but chilling: a dagger. Into its steel, he etched words that revealed the venom of his heart: death to the Pope. He carried it with him, a constant reminder of his mission, its weight in his pocket like the burden of his hatred. In secret, he rehearsed the moment. He pictured himself approaching the Holy Father, disguised among the faithful, imagining the Pope's startled eyes, the gasp of the crowd, the dagger striking swift and sure. In these fantasies, Hiroshi felt powerful, as though he were striking at the very heavens. But reality was less heroic than the visions in his mind. At night, as he polished the blade, shadows filled his room. Aiko, unaware of the details but sensing the darkness in him, prayed silently for protection. The children, too young to understand, felt the tension whenever their father disappeared for hours at a time, returning with eyes that burned like embers. Still, Hiroshi's conviction did not waver. He told himself he was chosen for this task, destined to rid the world of a false shepherd. To his twisted logic, it was not murder, it was liberation. Yet, even as he planned, there were moments that betrayed his humanity. Once, while holding the dagger, he caught sight of his youngest child, Sakura, asleep, her tiny hand clutching a worn scapular she had hidden from him. For a brief second, doubt flickered. Could a god so cruel to him still watch over this child with tenderness? He crushed the thought quickly, burying it beneath layers of pride. The dagger remained. The plan remained. But heaven, unseen, was already moving to stop him. The same hands that sharpened steel would soon be forced to drop it. The same heart that plotted death would soon beg for life. And the same man who wanted to strike at Christ's vicar would one day kneel before him, confessing the darkest secret of his soul. Hiroshi did not know it then, but destiny was waiting, not in the corridors of the Vatican, not in the chaos of an assassination, but in the quiet shadows of a Roman grotto, where a mother clothed in light would call him by name. And when that call came, it would shake him more deeply than any weapon ever could. It was an ordinary April afternoon in 1947, or so it seemed. The sky over Rome carried the warmth of spring, a welcome change after the harshness of winter. Hiroshi Tanaka, still harboring the dagger and the hatred etched into his heart, decided to take his 3 children, Sakura, Kenji, and Yumi, for a walk. Perhaps it was to clear his mind, perhaps simply to escape the tension of their small apartment. Whatever the reason, that decision would alter the course of his life forever. They wandered near the outskirts of the city toward a quiet place known as Tre Fontaine, the Three Fountains, an area not far from the abbey where centuries earlier St. Paul was said to have been martyred. The children, innocent and lively, chased after a ball, their laughter ringing across the fields. Hiroshi, lost in thought, sat apart, scribbling notes in his worn notebook, fragments of the speeches he dreamed of giving against the church. The minutes stretched into hours. As the sun dipped lower, he noticed his children had wandered further than he expected, toward a rocky grotto at the edge of the field. He called out, irritation rising. No answer. He stood, his voice sharper now, cutting across the air. Where are you? Come back. Then he saw them, 3 small figures kneeling in the dust before the dark mouth of the cave. Their hands were folded, their eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on something within the shadows. Hiroshi's irritation hardened into anger. He strode toward them, ready to scold, his voice prepared to lash out. But before he could speak, Sakura cried out, her voice trembling with awe, "Papa! The beautiful lady! The words pierced the silence like a bell. One by one, the children echoed it. The beautiful lady. Their faces glowed with wonder, as if seeing something Hiroshi could not. At first, he thought it was childish fancy, their imaginations running wild. He demanded they stop, his voice shaking, but they did not move. Their small knees pressed into the dirt, their eyes locked on the grotto, their lips whispering words he could not hear. A strange unease gripped him. He stepped closer, his anger faltering into confusion. What could hold their gaze so firmly? What could bring such stillness to children usually so restless? The air around the grotto felt different, heavy yet gentle, as though the atmosphere itself was alive. Hiroshi's pulse quickened. For a man who prided himself on rejecting superstition, the sensation was unnerving. He clenched his fists, fighting the growing fear that something beyond his control was unfolding. He barked at the children again, but their voices rose in harmony. The beautiful lady. Their eyes glistened with tears, not of fear, but of joy. Hiroshi's steps slowed against his will. He felt drawn toward the place where his children knelt. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to laugh at them, to shake them from their trance, to prove nothing was there. Yet deep within, a tremor of curiosity whispered, what if they are seeing something real? As he reached the entrance of the grotto, a chill ran through him. The shadows seemed to shimmer. Light, faint at first, began to pulse within the cave, not like fire or sunlight, but something purer, softer, and yet more radiant. Hiroshi froze. His mind raced, torn between disbelief and the undeniable reality of what his eyes began to perceive. In that moment, the man who had carried a dagger against the Pope found himself standing on the threshold of a mystery greater than any hatred he had ever known. And in the stillness of that grotto, heaven was about to break into his life. The air inside the grotto seemed to hum with silence. Hiroshi stepped forward cautiously, every muscle tense. He had expected darkness, damp stone, the ordinary smell of earth, but what met him was something otherworldly. The shadows dissolved into light. At first, it was faint, like the glimmer of dawn seeping through cracks. But within seconds, it grew into a radiance so brilliant it seemed to breathe. It was not blinding, but alive, golden, soft, filling every crevice of the grotto. Hiroshi's heart hammered. Sweat gathered on his brow. He told himself it was a trick of the eyes, a reflection, an illusion. Yet the light held steady, undeniable. And then he saw her, a woman, young and beautiful beyond words, clothed in a flowing gown of pure white. Around her head glowed a crown of soft brilliance, not of jewels but of light itself. Her eyes shone with tenderness that pierced deeper than any accusation, deeper even than his own hatred. Her hands, pale and graceful, extended toward him, not in judgment, but in welcome. Hiroshi froze. His lips parted, but no sound came. His children's voices echoed faintly behind him. The beautiful lady. The lady's hand moved gently, as though brushing through the air, and Hiroshi felt it against his cheek, as real as any human touch. A warmth spread through him, flowing into the very marrow of his bones. And with that touch came something he had not known in years, peace. Then pain, a sharp, searing pain, not of the body, but of the soul. It was as if scales were being torn from his eyes, as if layers of bitterness were being ripped away. He gasped, stumbling, clutching his face. Darkness engulfed him, thick and suffocating. He panicked, thinking he had gone blind. But then, like a sunrise breaking through clouds, the darkness dissolved. Light, pure, unshakable, filled him. It was not the light of the grotto. It was the light within, piercing into corners he had hidden, cleansing wounds he had carried since boyhood. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling down his cheeks. The dagger in his pocket seemed to burn, not with heat, but with shame. He collapsed to his knees. His chest heaved, each breath heavy with surrender. For the first time in years, he did not feel anger. He did not feel bitterness. He felt small, small before the majesty of a love greater than he had ever allowed himself to believe in. The lady did not speak yet, but her gaze said everything. You are not abandoned. You are not forgotten. You are loved. Hiroshi buried his face in his hands, sobbing. His children, still kneeling at the entrance, whispered prayers. The grotto was no longer a cave of stone. It was a sanctuary. Heaven itself had broken through its walls. Minutes passed like eternity. Hiroshi dared to lift his eyes again. She was still there, radiant, serene, patient, as if she had waited for him all his life. And in that gaze, the man who once carried a blade for the Pope felt his hatred melt like wax before flame. He could not resist it. He did not want to resist it. All he could do, all he would ever remember doing, was fall to the ground, trembling, and whisper the only words his broken heart could form, Mary, forgive me. The grotto was drenched in silence, but it was a silence that carried weight, alive, expectant. Hiroshi knelt, trembling, unsure if his racing heart could withstand what he was experiencing. And then, at last, the lady spoke. Her voice was not thunderous, not commanding, but soft and clear, like water flowing over stone. It carried both tenderness and authority, a mother's whisper with the gravity of eternity. "You have persecuted me long enough," she said gently. "Now return to the church." The words struck Hiroshi like arrows of light. They were not accusations, but invitations, not condemnation, but mercy. He bowed his head lower, unable to meet her eyes, his tears staining the dust beneath him. The lady continued, "Pray the rosary every day. Pray for sinners. Pray for those who do not believe. And pray for the unity of my son's church." Hiroshi's hands shook. The rosary, he had despised it, mocked it, torn it from Aiko's hands. And now the Mother of God herself was commanding him to take it up, to let it be the chain that bound his family, not in superstition, but in salvation. Then her gaze shifted, solemn, as if unveiling secrets hidden since time began. With her hand, she gestured to the ground before him. Hiroshi looked, and in a vision, he saw a dark cloth spread like a shroud. Upon it lay a broken cross, fractured, desecrated. His breath caught. A chill raced down his spine. "This is from the book of Revelation," the lady said softly. "A sign of the trials to come. Many will lose faith. Many will turn away. The world will know sorrow. And the church will face division." Her words weighed heavily on Hiroshi. He saw glimpses, men abandoning prayer, families broken, churches emptied, nations at war. The images seared themselves into his memory, warnings of a future not far away. But then her voice rose, filled with hope. "Do not despair. My son is Lord of history. Through repentance, through prayer, through faith, grace will triumph." Hiroshi lifted his head, trembling. He dared to whisper, "Who are you, lady? Tell me your name." The lady's eyes glowed with love. She placed her hand upon her chest and spoke words that would echo in his soul until his dying breath. "I am the Mother of Revelation." The title rang through the grotto like a bell, Mother, not just of Nazareth or Bethlehem, but of Revelation itself, the fulfillment of prophecy, the mother who crushes the serpent, the witness to the final victory of her son. Hiroshi gasped, overwhelmed. The woman he had mocked, whose image he had thrown into the trash, was revealing herself as the guardian of the church, the mother who intercedes even for those who hate her. Then, as if entrusting him with a mission he could barely comprehend, she said, "Take this message to the Holy Father, the vicar of my son. Tell him what you have seen. Tell him what I have spoken. Be not afraid." Hiroshi's chest tightened. The dagger he had carried for the Pope weighed heavier than ever, now not with purpose, but with shame. Yet in that moment, he felt the stirrings of a new mission. He had been called not to destroy, but to proclaim, not to kill, but to witness. The mother's final words burned into his heart. "Do not grow weary, even if some will not believe you. Be steadfast. My son will be with you, and I will never abandon you." With that, the vision dimmed, though her presence lingered like the warmth of a fire. The grotto returned to shadow, but Hiroshi was not the same man who had entered it. The dagger was still in his pocket, but now it was no longer a weapon, it was a testimony. The grotto at Trefontaine had left Hiroshi shaken to the core. The mother's words echoed endlessly in his mind, "Take this message to the Holy Father. Be not afraid." For days, he wrestled with the command. Fear not at him. He, Hiroshi Tanaka, who had sworn to kill the Pope, now carried a mission to deliver heaven's message to him. How could he walk into the Vatican, knowing the blade he once intended for Pius XII still rested in his possession? Yet deep inside, he knew he could not resist. Something had shifted irrevocably. The man who once cursed the church now longed to kneel within it. With trembling hands, he prepared for the journey. He carried two items as proof of his past and his conversion. The first was the dagger, cold and sharp, with the words, "Death to the Pope," still etched along its steel. The second was his Bible, once weaponized against the church, its margins scribbled with venomous notes that twisted scripture into hate. To him, these objects were symbols of who he had been, of the darkness he was leaving behind. When the day came, he approached the Vatican walls with a pounding heart. The grandeur of St. Peter's Square only deepened his unease. Tourists bustled about, pilgrims prayed, but Hiroshi walked with heavy steps, clutching the dagger and the Bible wrapped in cloth. His children, Sakura, Kenji, and Yumi, clung to his side, wide-eyed, while Aiko silently prayed for courage. Inside the Vatican, guards eyed him with suspicion. Yet somehow, Providence opened the way. Word of his request reached the Pope's household. Perhaps it was the urgency in his voice, perhaps the mysterious hand of grace. Whatever the reason, the doors did not remain shut. At last, Hiroshi stood before Pope Pius XII. The Holy Father's presence was striking, calm, dignified, yet fatherly, his white robes radiant against the grandeur of the room. Hiroshi fell to his knees at once, his hands shaking as he placed the wrapped bundle on the floor before him. "Most Holy Father," he stammered, tears choking his voice. "I come not to harm, but to beg forgiveness." With trembling fingers, he unwrapped the dagger. The steel glinted under the Vatican lights, the hateful words carved into its blade visible to all. Gasps filled the room. Hiroshi's tears fell onto the floor as he whispered, "This was meant for you." Silence. Then, with a voice steady and filled with compassion, Pius replied, "My son, had you killed me, you would not have destroyed the church. You would only have given her another martyr. But by your repentance, by your return, you give her something far greater, a witness to Christ's mercy." Hiroshi wept openly, unable to speak. The Pope bent down, placed his hand upon Hiroshi's head, and blessed him. In that moment, the walls of hatred collapsed completely. Hiroshi felt not only forgiven by a man, but embraced by the very love of God. The Bible lay beside the dagger, its pages worn with his angry annotations. The Pope picked it up gently and handed it back. "Use this now," he said softly, "not as a weapon, but as a light." Hiroshi pressed the book to his chest, overwhelmed. He had come to confess his darkest secret, to reveal the crime he once dreamed of committing. Instead, he left with forgiveness, blessing, and a mission renewed. That day, the Vatican witnessed something more powerful than an assassination attempt. It witnessed a resurrection of the heart. A man once consumed by hate, now reborn as a herald of grace. Though the dagger would never cut flesh, its story would cut into countless souls for generations to come. When Hiroshi left the Vatican that day, he was not the same man who had entered. The dagger that once symbolized hatred now lay silent, stripped of its power. The Bible, once a tool of mockery, had been returned to him as a lamp for his steps. But the greatest change was invisible, the transformation of his heart. For the first time in decades, Hiroshi walked through the streets of Rome with peace. His children sensed it before he even spoke. The sharpness in his voice was gone. The heaviness in his eyes had lifted. Aiko, seeing the change, wept quietly, her prayers answered. The Tanaka household, once a battleground, began to heal, its walls no longer echoing with anger but with the quiet rhythm of the rosary, now welcomed back into their home. Aiko, who had prayed in secret for years, wept with relief as she saw in her husband not the man who tore down crucifixes, but a man who now bent to kiss them. Yet conversion is not a single moment, it is a lifetime. For Hiroshi, that lifetime had only begun. He returned to the grotto at Tre Fontaine often, kneeling on the same ground where the Mother of Revelation had appeared. There, he prayed the rosary she had commanded, his lips stumbling at first over the prayers he once mocked. Slowly, they became familiar, then beloved. The rosary was no longer superstition, it was his lifeline. Word spread quickly. The story of a man who once plotted the Pope's death but was claimed by the Mother of Revelation reached priests, bishops, and ordinary believers. Some dismissed it as fantasy, the ramblings of a desperate man. But others saw in Hiroshi's tears a sincerity impossible to fabricate. He did not keep silent. Wherever he went, he told the story. In homes, churches, and public squares, he spoke of the beautiful lady who had touched his cheek, of the light that had broken into his darkness, of the message she had given him. His voice carried not the arrogance of ideology, but the urgency of a witness who had seen and could not deny. Out of this mission, Hiroshi helped form associations dedicated to prayer and penance. He gathered men and women who, like him, had once wandered far from faith and invited them to find healing at Tre Fontaine. The grotto itself began to draw pilgrims, fathers, mothers, children, sinners, skeptics, all kneeling where Hiroshi and his children once knelt, hoping to encounter grace. But Hiroshi's path was not without trials. Some accused him of fabrication, of using his story for fame. Others mocked him, saying, no true apparition could come to a man like him. These doubts cut deeply, but he clung to the mother's words, do not grow weary, even if some will not believe you. So he pressed on. He knew the truth of what he had seen, what he had felt. No ridicule could erase the memory of that hand upon his face, of the light that had pierced his heart. As years passed, Hiroshi became a father not only to his children, Sakura, Kenji, and Yumi, but to countless souls who looked to him as proof that no one is beyond redemption. He spoke often of mercy, urging others never to despair. No matter how far they had strayed, his story became a living parable that God's grace does not wait for saints, it pursues sinners in their darkest hour. Yet Hiroshi never glorified himself. Whenever people praised his courage, he shook his head. It was not my courage, he would say. It was her love, her hand. Without her, I was nothing but hate. By the time decades had passed, the once angry, bitter man had become a herald of hope. His life was a testament to the mother's promise that, even in the face of disbelief, her maternal heart would never abandon her children. The world knew him no longer as the man with a dagger, but as the man with a rosary. The grotto of Tre Fontaine, once just a lonely cave on the outskirts of Rome, could never again be seen as ordinary. From the moment Hiroshi and his children encountered the beautiful lady, it became a place marked by mystery. And heaven was not finished with it. In the years that followed, Hiroshi returned often to kneel where he had once fallen in disbelief. To him, that ground was sacred, a place where heaven had broken through the veil of earth. Sometimes, though not always, the mother appeared to him again. Each time, her presence brought the same peace, the same light, the same maternal voice urging prayer, penance, and hope. Word of these encounters spread beyond Rome. Pilgrims trickled in, some curious, others desperate for healing, still others skeptical but unable to ignore the whispers of grace. Slowly, the trickle became a stream. Families walked for miles to kneel at the grotto. Soldiers scarred from war stood in silence, seeking consolation. Mothers pressed rosaries into their children's hands, pointing to the cave with trembling faith. For many, Tre Fontaine became known as the sanctuary of repentance. Confessions were heard in hushed voices at the grotto's edge. Men and women left behind the burdens of sin, walking away with tears on their cheeks and light in their hearts. What had once been a place of hatred and conspiracy now radiated mercy. The church, cautious but attentive, began to investigate. Vatican officials visited, questioning Hiroshi, studying his words, examining his life. They knew his past, his hatred, his dagger, his plan to kill the Pope. Yet they also saw the undeniable change in him, a change too deep to be staged. Documents were collected, testimonies recorded. The grotto's history of martyrdom, tradition held that St. Paul had been executed nearby, only deepened its significance. Not everyone believed. Some scoffed, calling Hiroshi a fraud. Others suggested he sought attention or pity. But the pilgrims kept coming. Miracles of healing, both physical and spiritual, were whispered about in the crowds, broken marriages reconciled, addictions abandoned, faith rekindled. The grotto had become more than stone, it had become a fountain of grace. By the 1950s and 60s, devotion at Tre Fontaine was thriving. Statues of the Mother were placed within the grotto. Candles flickered day and night, and the rosary echoed in dozens of languages from the lips of pilgrims around the world. Priests offered mass at a small altar nearby, their voices rising above the hum of prayer. In time, the church recognized the significance of the place. It was not declared an official Marian apparition like Lourdes or Fatima, but it was acknowledged as a site of devotion, carefully studied and reverently preserved. Popes themselves showed interest. Pius XII, who had once faced Hiroshi's dagger, received him more than once, affirming the authenticity of his repentance. Decades later, other pontiffs, including John Paul II, would also acknowledge the power of Tre Fontaine. For Hiroshi, this was more than vindication, it was fulfillment. The Mother had told him that the grotto would be a place of penance, that countless souls would pass through it as through a furnace of purification. And now, before his eyes, it was happening. The very cave where his hatred had died had become a refuge for thousands. On quiet evenings, Hiroshi would stand aside, watching pilgrims kneel where his children, Sakura, Kenji, and Yumi, had knelt. He would hear the same words whispered that had once startled him, the beautiful lady, and his heart would swell with gratitude. The man who once planned to kill the Pope now guarded a shrine where people found God's mercy. The grotto of Tre Fontaine had been transformed, just as he had been. Once a place of darkness, it was now a beacon of light. Hiroshi Tanaka lived many years after that fateful afternoon in 1947. He became not a destroyer of faith, but its witness. The man who once carried a dagger for the Pope now carried a rosary. He spoke not with the fury of hatred, but with the fire of testimony. Until his death in 2001, his life bore the mark of a miracle, the kind of miracle that cannot be denied because it is written not only in history but in the heart. Tre Fontaine itself changed too. What was once a neglected cave on the edge of Rome became a place of prayer, confession, and reconciliation. Pilgrims came from every corner of the world. Some arrived curious, others desperate, and many left transformed. The grotto, like Hiroshi, became a symbol of redemption, proof that light can conquer darkness, that mercy can heal even the deepest wounds. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Hiroshi's conversion was not the shrine, nor the associations he founded, but the living reminder that no soul is too far gone. If a man who plotted the death of a pope could be brought to his knees by the touch of the Mother of Revelation, then who among us is beyond hope? The Mother did not choose a saint to carry her message. She chose a sinner, a rebel, an enemy of the Church. And by choosing him, she gave hope to all of us that even in our worst failures, heaven is not finished. Grace waits. Mercy pursues. Love never gives up. Today, when faith seems fragile and the world often drifts further from God, the message of Tre Fontaine still speaks: pray the rosary. Pray for sinners. Pray for unity. And do not lose heart. Hiroshi's story reminds us that the battle between light and darkness is not abstract, it lives within each heart. And just as Hiroshi discovered, the mother still reaches for us with a mother's hand, still whispers words of mercy, still points to her son as the way, the truth, and the life. In the end, Hiroshi was not remembered as the man with the dagger, but as the man with a mission, not as the enemy of the Pope, but as the friend of Christ's mother. His life, like the grotto of Trefontaine, stands as a beacon, proof that God's grace is stronger than our hatred and that Mary's love is deeper than our sin. And so, as we close this story, perhaps the invitation is the same given to Hiroshi, to return, to pray, to believe that no one is too far gone for God's mercy. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that miracles still happen, and grace still finds us where we least expect it.